Hello, good morning, everyone, once again. Great to see everyone. What a great turnout. I'm really excited about this session today. We have two true experts, and I hope you'll take a minute to look at the program to see their histories from a high school dropout to a multi-time entrepreneur. And the concept behind this, and when we had our working groups this spring, was what are other people driven industries doing? We know that if we just keep doing the way we've always been doing within the education space, that we'll keep getting the same results we've always had, which I think is what the definition of insanity. So what can we learn from other people driven industries? As many of you know, I've come from the private sector, and hiring, we used all sorts of other tools to recruit into the profession and even into education programs. Other than what we traditionally are using in education, particularly GPAs and SATs and praxis exams, which we've known to be not as helpful recruiting tools. So today we get to hear from true industry experts with Carl Nordgren and Mark Tully, who have merged together to grow to form Being Better Than Before. And they'll share with you some of the tools. And what I also love about these two is Carl is a creativity expert. For any of you who think you are not creative, he can prove to you that you can be. And so within our conversations today, the whole point is to be really creative and thinking outside the box. So of course, nobody better than Carl to help us with that, and Mark as well. So we will kick this off. Mark, Carl, thank you for being here. And for everyone, if you want to, please put questions in the chat, and we will be getting to the chat at the end of their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you for the opportunity to be talking to everybody today. We've been really looking forward to this session. I'm Mark. I'm the better looking of the team of two. I will alert you to the fact, although I have an English accent, I am here in Raleigh. I'm being beamed live here from Raleigh. And I say that because I was on a similar conference last week, and people just assumed I was back in England because I have an English accent. So I am from England, but I'm here on your doorstep, so to speak. So I'll get today's session underway. What can we learn from other people-driven industries? And I think the first thing to alert you to is that a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking to you about and the tool that we use and the experiences is, and my own expertise certainly is in deploying this tool in industries and organizations where the customer service, the experience of the customer between that employee on the front line and a customer in whatever context that is, that's absolutely mission critical to the success of those organizations. That's the kind of experience that we have, just to give you some context. But to start this underway, we have a poll that we'd like to ask you. There's a question that we'd like to ask you just to get things underway. And I think you've seen the session objectives before. And here's the poll. If everybody would please give this some consideration and mark a response. And the question is, are teachers born or are they made? What do you think? Are teachers born, they're naturally born and gifted to be teachers? Or can we construct and make and develop teachers? What's your thoughts? And the results that we see is that they are a few perhaps say born, but 90% say made. Very interesting. I'm going to make a note of that. And I'm going to return to that question a little bit later and pose that question again. And perhaps what might happen through this, for some of you, depending on which you voted for there, it may slightly change your opinion in terms of how we answer that question. So with that, let's move on. And we thought, given that we're giving some insights and context from other industries, that just share with you some global recruitment trends that are just happening in the private sector at this moment in time. And I'll just start with technology, like every other aspect of life, technology has and continues to impact the recruitment process, and do it from two different perspectives. How organizations go about recruiting is changing based on technology, And here's the important one as well: how candidates are seeking jobs and how they're responding to jobs in the marketplace is also very much driven by technology. So a lot taking place with technology in this day and age. And some of that is good and some of that is not so good, which brings me to the second point as a trend. There's a real focus now on the candidate experience. With the growth in job boards such as Indeed and LinkedIn and ZipRecruiter, recruiting has really become very impersonal, and that's a negative aspect of technology. So companies have realized this and woken up to the fact that candidate experience is really, really important in the first stage of recruitment, which is to attract the talent. How do you make sure that the right talent is clicking on your job and applying for your job? And I'm going to give you some examples about how organizations are doing that. And there's some really interesting research out there. As an example, when a candidate goes through a positive experience with an organization, but they're actually rejected, 70% of them will reapply to the same company, and the same 70% would even recommend family and friends to that organization. Such as, if the experience is right, it's very positive, and organizations are using this to attract the right caliber of talent into their organizations. The next two come together really. Fair recruitment practices and analytics kind of come together, that companies are continuing to strive for better decision making to promote diversity. And that shows itself through in how companies are trying to make the whole process much fairer, much less prone to bias. And analytics is a way of helping that, and we'll give some examples. Onboarding is becoming extremely important. Onboarding is now, one recommendation I would make to people on this call, if you're involved in the recruitment process, is consider onboarding as a part of the recruitment process. Yes, somebody may have been hired, but what is their emotional decision and what's their emotional experience in the critical first few days and weeks that they are in the new role, in a new school environment? That's going to be critical to their emotional buy-in to the role and how they're going to perform in the future. So companies are really rethinking the onboarding experience from that point of view. And the last one is, and really several of these points come back to the increasing use and application of assessments. Based on different researches, between 42 to 50% of corporate America are using assessment tools in the recruitment process. And that's been growing significantly in the last few years. Why? Because it's a way of creating a fairer recruitment process. It's a way of bringing analytics into the decision-making process. And if I link back to the candidate experience, another piece of research from candidates is when they are faced with an assessment tool and an assessment questionnaire of some form as part of a recruitment process, they don't get concerned by that. They actually value it because they perceive that that's an organization that is striving to operate to fair recruitment practices, and therefore it's taken positively. Now, here's just again to pose a sort of context setting for this session. I'm going to ask you to choose. Imagine that you had to make a recruitment decision this morning to recruit a new teacher, and these were your three candidates. Imagine that they've all gone through the recruitment process and scored well in terms of the vibe in those interviews. Their resumes and the qualifications all stack up. But I'm going to put you under pressure here. You have to choose one of these three candidates. Who do you choose? And as you're thinking about that, perhaps do certain unconscious biases start to come in terms of who we might select? And there's something that we know through the brain in neuroscience, and the product we use is a behavior-based neuroscience tool. We know from neuroscience that people are attracted to likes, so we tend to be influenced by people who are more like us, which can be a bias within the recruitment process. But let me make this easier for you. I'm going to reveal their GPAs. Actually, I've not made this any easier. So you now know that they're all scored really, really well on their GPAs. They're all at 4. So again, which one of these do you choose? It's still a bit difficult to really make a decision which of these three. So let me make it a little bit easier. And perhaps their GPA is not 4. Perhaps it's a different GPA, and it's just going to come up on the screen in a second. Now, does that make the decision any easier? Perhaps you'd be considering, well, all things being correct about interviewing and the resumes and everything else, perhaps we will go for the lady on the right-hand side. But what if I told you that through our analysis, we predict the lady in the middle with the lowest GPA actually would predict to be the highest performer in that teaching post. How do we get that? There's something else at play here other than the interview, other than the GPA. And I'm going to reveal some really interesting insights to you on the next slide. So this is a piece of research undertaken several years ago by Michigan State University. There are 6 factors that you see here down the left-hand side, and each of these, it scores based on research, the degree of the contribution to predicting a successful recruitment decision that each of these factors have. So the first noteworthy point is the interview and the resume, through research done by Michigan State University, contributes only 14% towards a successful recruitment decision. And that then increases onwards, as you see, with the introduction of background checks. That moves that from 14 to 26. Skills and ability testing moves it from 26 to 43. Now, those first three factors are the most common ones that are used in recruitment today. And why? Because these are the relatively easier things. You know, the interview obviously is a physical process. It's tangible. The resume is tangible. Background checks, bringing in an agency that undertakes background checks and who reports. This is all kind of tangible stuff. But they only contribute, those first 3 contribute less than half to making a successful recruitment decision. And more than 50% is the 3 factors that you see next. Suitability benchmarking, which is about benchmarking a role based on the behavioral needs of the job, work attitude assessment, and work environment matching. These 3 are more than half of making a successful recruitment decision. I think about this as my analogy would be baking a cake. If you've got 6 ingredients to bake a cake, would we use all 6? What would happen if we only used 3 of the 6? So what we're really talking to you about here today is narrowing down on these bottom 3 in terms of the kind of analysis that this provides, the opportunity of how you can be more confident about making successful recruitment decisions. And building on this, and I'm talking about in overall terms, I'm talking about the concept of behavior. And I want to use a case study for this, a simple case study. And that case study is Apple. And think about the Apple company purely in a retail context. Okay, it's known in the industry that Apple has a tremendously rigorous approach to recruitment for managerial positions. And several years ago, as they were had global recruitment practices taking place, as they were rolling out stores on a global basis, Apple-owned company stores. On average, it takes them 6 months to recruit somebody into a managerial position. Now, what I'm not suggesting that in education we have to move to a 6-month timeline. That's not the point to this. But the point is how they go about recruitment and the rigor with which they use it and the number of different recruitment tools that they use, including assessment, and how successful this part of Apple has been. I think everybody would agree, if you go into an Apple store, if you go into different Apple stores in different parts of the United States, it's pretty much a consistent service and experience that somebody receives. Apple is absolutely fixated on the customer experience, in this case within retail. And here's a personal insight. My son-in-law a few years ago was approached by a recruitment company asking him his interest to engage in the recruitment process with Apple to be a retail store manager. And the first thing they said is, this is going to take 6 months. Okay, so they're honest about that. But here's the really interesting thing I want to share with you. My son-in-law has never spent a single day of his career in retail. His entire career was in hospitality. So Apple are looking for people not from the same industry. They're prepared to go into other industries, but industries that have the kind of culture that they are trying to create for their organization. And they identify hotels and restaurants and hospitality generally. They wanted people with experience where behaviors and leading people to ensure successful outcomes at the front line between staff and customers was really, really important. So just some insights about how companies are seeking to do things differently in a number of different ways. So I've started this kind of thing, this concept about behavior, and it's the behavior. If you go back to that bar chart, it's the behavioral aspects that's a better predictor of future performance. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about why is this? What is it about this behavior that is so special? And by the way, I should mention that we're talking about assessing and using behavior as the context to helping understand how people will perform in the future and then match to role. We're not talking about personality. Some people tend to use those two terms interchangeably, but they're very, very different things. Our personality is fixed and is developed at a fairly young age for most of us, whereas behavior is dynamic. We have a number of different behavior preferences and our behaviors change over time. So what we're finding in the private sector is companies are moving away from some of the more historical, older world personality-based tools, more towards behavioral-based tools on the basis that they are better predictors of future performance. And our behavior, where do my behavior preferences come from? Where do you? It all relates to the brain. So let me give you some insights of what happens when the behaviors of the individual, irrespective of their qualifications, when you get a good match between the behavioral preferences of the individual and the job, a number of things are happening. And this is where you really get high performance. Those people are much more intrinsically motivated. They're more productive at what they do. They exert discretionary effort in what they do. They persist in the face of hardship and setbacks longer. They provide better quality output. Another term for that is better business outcomes, or in a teaching context, better student outcomes. And they have a capacity for creativity. And Carl's going to talk to that in a few moments' time. So the reason we bring this to your attention is that once an individual's behaviors are understood, and if their behavior preferences match with the needs of the job, then their performance is much, much higher. Why is that? Because their set of behavior preferences is how their brain is wired through lifetime experiences, partly inherited and partly nurtured. So when you put somebody into a role where their behaviors match, it's actually their brain that's matched, and their brain is enjoying the work that is being done. The brain is a status quo machine. So if you force somebody into a role that doesn't match their own behaviors, their brain literally has to work harder. And therefore you don't get certain outcomes like discretionary effort and persisting for longer and intrinsic motivation. And I've used this slide frequently in the last few weeks, and there's a point I like to make about this to use an example. Think about what's going on in the world right now for the last 8 or 9 months and the frontline health workers in this crisis that we've been faced with. How many times have we read or heard about frontline health workers walking off the job? How many times have we heard about them quitting? We don't. I'm not aware of any. Think about the danger that they put themselves through. They are working extended hours. Probably a lot of the time they're not getting overtime. They are putting themselves at risk in terms of their health and the health of their families, but they still go to it day after day after day. That's something telling about the behavioral match of those individuals and how they're attracted into healthcare in the first place, versus other jobs which people give up very easily when there's no danger to them. So does this work? Does this behavioral piece work? This is just 4 case studies of work we've done, recruitment using PRISM. So PRISM brain mapping is the product that we use. We work with clients where we create a benchmark for a job first before the recruitment process happens. And then candidates are screened against that, but that data is used not just for screening, but for interviewing and then for onboarding of the successful candidates. And there's a couple of data points here that I'd like to bring your attention to. The first one is actually the first row, ratio of screened candidates matched to a success profile. Financial services, I was personally involved in this one particular project, 32% match. That means 68% of applicants for a job weren't behaviorally matched. So how we help organizations to be more efficient and to speed up recruitment is, rather than being random and perhaps being faced with interviewing people who are not well matched for the job, and on average in industry, there are 10 to 11 interviews for each post that needs to be filled. Well, with PRISM consistently, we reduce that by about half, because we're able to identify the real high caliber candidates, not from an education point of view, not from a qualification point of view, from a behavioral point of view. So that's data point number 1. And that whole thing about identifying them early speeds up the recruitment process, less time involved in interviews, and all that has got cost and efficiency benefits to it. The second data point on the financial services is retain for at least 1 year. Now you think, a year's not a long time, so maybe we'd expect a lot of people to stay for a long time. Some of these industries are very transient. Retail sales, as an example, it's common for organizations to see 50% turnover of retail sales staff. Here we see retained after 1 year, 85%. Because if the people match the job, then they will stay in that job longer because they're enjoying the job, they're getting satisfaction and all that kind of good stuff. Okay, financial services, before we did this case study, their attrition rate within 12 months was 73%. Or 73% were staying, which means 27% were leaving the organization within the first year. We moved that from 73% retained to 88% retained. That's a 15% difference. Again, all sorts of cost associated with that, cost savings. But think about service continuity. Every time a job is lost, whether it's a school teacher or somebody in financial services or retail sales, anytime there's a vacancy, that creates a disruption to service. So we're about helping organizations not just necessarily lower costs, but it's about lowering disruptions to quality service and things of that nature. And the last point is the last line here, those ranked as a high performer at the end of the first year. That's not a prison brain mapping ranking, that's the client's own ranking as they define it, is very, very high. And that's because through benchmarking, we're looking at recruiting potential high performers to a job based on their behavioral match to that job. It's time for another quick poll. We're talking about this thing about behavior, which also involves creativity. So we just want to spend a few moments talking about this with you on these two particular aspects, creativity and collaboration. How important are these going to be in the future, in your view? Not very important somewhere. Do you think they're going to be very important? Do you think they're going to be highly important in teaching? In a teaching post, how important will creativity and collaboration be in the future? So interesting, for the vast majority, it's either going to be very important or it's going to be highly important. Thank you for doing that. That's great context setting for what we're going to come to next. And this is a copy and paste from a job advert posted this week for a secondary school teacher on Indeed.com. This is a complete copy and paste of part of the advert, not everything. And I've purposely taken part of the job description for this and the skills, duties, and responsibilities. That's the entire of those on this particular Indeed posting. And I've posted this for a particular reason and a number of points we want to talk around. The first one is, if you look at all the points highlighted as bold here, so under job description, applying energy and a positive attitude, then in the skills, duties, responsibilities, an orderly environment, works collaboratively, collaboration with colleagues to mentor, develops lessons, values contributors. All these things are behavioral. None of these things are talking about how qualified somebody is. So maybe the qualification and what we've learned in the private sector and the private sector takes on board is qualification may be the entry ticket. Qualification may be that first part of the screening process to make sure that people have a range of qualifications required. But this thing about behavior, going back to that bar chart I showed you, it'd be more than 50% of the success prediction shows itself here. So an interesting point about this is using the product that we have and the words within this job advert, we can start to codify what are the behaviors necessary to be a high performer based on these aspects. Okay, so we can get very granular, building a behavior-based benchmark in order to use that to understand. And as an example, how this has benefits. How do you identify if somebody's going to be a good collaborator? Okay. We can ask them questions within the interview, but wouldn't it be much stronger if we could understand based on their own inherent behavior preferences, if they had a natural preference to collaborate, if it's something that they valued, it's something that they enjoyed doing, that's what assessment can do for us. So in an interview, we can ask the question and get a frame of reference and somebody, sure, yeah, I'm a collaborator, and people can kind of perhaps on the spur of the moment, even make something up to demonstrate collaboration. But there's a difference between I'm collaborating because I have to versus I'm collaborating because I want to, and it's an essential part of who I am, and I really enjoy doing it. So that's the collaboration piece. I'm just going to bring Carl in, who is our resident expert on this call on creativity, who's going to talk to you for a few moments on that piece. Carl, over to you. Leo, has Carl been unmuted?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, and I'll just make a couple of comments. I'll just make a couple of quick comments. One is that I love that poll finding where you, was it 98% of you said it's going to either be highly important or very important being creative in the future. My sense is that any single one of these bolded behaviors that Mark has identified in this job description, every single one of them will be performed more effectively, more efficiently, with better results, the more creative somebody is in that role. Let me just very quickly say, when I'm talking about creativity, I'm not talking about the limited picture of creativity of being artistic. I draw a great big circle when I talk about creativity. I talk about people who are problem solvers. I talk about people who intentionally challenge the status quo. I talk about people who are generous in their approach to a new idea, because when you're generous to a new idea, it's a generative energy that gets created when you're generous. And what a wonderful quality to have when you're going to collaborate, right? Is to be generous with the ideas that others are sharing, because a wonderful generative energy gets created. To pick another one is to talk about empowering students. I can tell you that in my entrepreneurial experiences in the private sector, the very best way to empower employees is to create a space, is to not over define the project that you want them to work on, not define it so tightly that they have very limited space to bring their own sense of what should be accomplished, but to leave some space. And so I did teach for 14 years at Duke University, undergraduates, nearly 60 courses. So I have a fair amount of time in a classroom, and I learned that when I give an assignment, especially an important assignment, an assignment that's going to be a significant part of a student's grade, that I would suggest what it is that they should be doing, that I would create broad parameters, and I would give them lots of opportunity to define for themselves, to ask the questions that'll help them define for themselves, what's the best way for me to tackle this project? What's the best way to take it on? It would frustrate some of the students initially because they were accustomed to being in an academic world where they were always told exactly what it is that they were supposed to be doing, exactly how they're going to be measured on it. And so I would say to them, I am intentionally providing this space. I don't want you to leave the classroom frustrated. I will stay here and answer your questions as long as you have questions for me to answer. But I want you to define the very best way to take this project on. It, again, served me so very well in my entrepreneurial world. I learned that it worked to empower students in the classrooms as well. So again, my rallying cry is always, Brenda did a great job of introducing me. I find in all of the work that I am doing that it's important to bring the most creative portions of you to that work. And it's, you know, all the systems, all the processes will benefit. Just a quick, I did a workshop about a year ago, a 5-hour half-day retreat for Durham County and Durham City's Department of Finance. And they were delighted to discover how much opportunity there was to bring fresh creative thinking to the processes that they had been doing time and time again. So perhaps that's my final message to you all, is to just embrace, as clearly the poll suggests you're ready to embrace, the importance of cultivating a creative quality in all of this work that you are doing.
I think just my closing comment on this particular slide, to Carl's point there, is if somebody doesn't match the behavioral needs of the job, their opportunity to bring creativity into what they do is somewhat stifled, because the brain is not working the way it likes to work. When somebody's behaviors don't match the job, the brain has to work harder. And that leaves less scope for people to really harvest and bring creativity to what they do. I'm just trying to change to the next.
Mark and Carl, we've got to move on to Q&A. We've got a couple of really good ones in here. And Zach is going to move us to your action item slide so we can have that showing everyone. This whole deck is available online on the landing page, but there's some really great pieces in here. Mark, if there's anything you want to highlight before we move to the questions.
No, I think we've covered all the key points. So the conclusion slide, just, you know, once people behavior match a role, they deliver better business outcomes. There is one question that I've seen in the comments just while Carl was talking, perhaps one I can actually take on, and it's an issue that somebody's raised, which is very, very relevant, about the pressures associated with the job. and the additional workload. And the comment I've heard before, which is, if only I could just teach. But there seems to be more and more things that are piled up onto teachers. And of course, this year in particular, we've seen significant disruption for obvious reasons. So there is one slide in here where we're going to ask you a poll to think which of these 4 behaviors we were showing is the most important, okay? And you'll see that if you go through this. And there's one particular standout behavior, and we've also seen this in behavior benchmarks for teaching posts that's on o.net, which is the Department of Labor jobs database. So look into those slides in here. So my point I'm going to get to is this thing again about matching behaviors. The most important behavior for the majority of teaching positions is a behavior that we call in our circles in neuroscience a behavior of stability. It's about kindness, compassion, consideration, and things of that nature. But it's also a behavior that values routine, regimental kind of work. And that's really, really important. If somebody doesn't have that, and teaching is highly routine, think about it in that sense, in terms of people going to the same classroom, teaching the same curriculum every day, seeing the same students, and so on and so forth. It's highly routine. That's one aspect of this behavioral fit. If somebody has other aspects, but they prefer not that kind of routine process, they're going to be less of high performance. So if we have people have the right match, they will ride out the storms that we all go through in life. Let me repeat that so we're clear on this. If people have the right behavioral match, the behavior I'm talking about, stability, is an unrelenting focus on other people. People with this behavior, it's more important how others feel than themselves. They will go out of the way. So if you allow me to just build on this for a second, those teachers who will work till midnight because they have to now re-engineer their lesson plans because of the disruption, those will work hard. They're not doing it because of the technology that's now used. What's driving them is not thanks for doing content in the right way. What's driving them is the student outcome. And that relates to the certain behaviors that drive that. And those people will withstand the pressure more than others. So I hope I've answered that question. But Brenda, back to you for the question session.
No, I think you addressed some of them. There was a question also about pathways and how this can be used for career pathways. I think you maybe have that even on a slide here.
Yeah. So there is a careers engine to the product that we have, and I mentioned o.net a little bit earlier. So as I understand it, o.net, if you to go onto that website, the US Department of Labor, it has a large array of jobs in the jobs database, but they're text. People have to read through pages of text to understand the job. What we're able to do is that an individual can do their own PRISM assessment, and then they go through the careers engine, or we do it on their behalf or on a client's behalf, and we match them behaviorally based on the behavioral preferences of the individual. Which jobs and occupations are you best behaviorally matched to? We were going to show you that on one particular slide. So there is a way, if you think about those first 2 aspects of the primary gateways as part of the NC Stride project, the interest and the exposure can be done, whether it's perhaps people who are already in the workforce being attracted into teaching, think in the context perhaps more so of students in college and high school students, in terms of we can start to match them. And here's how it's really, really powerful with an individual, with a student. Imagine there's 2 different conversations about trying to attract interest in a student to teaching. The first one is, are you interested in teaching? That's a common question. It's very different to say to a student, do you realize based on your behavioral makeup that you've got a great match to be a chemistry teacher? And this is telling us that you would be a very high performer. And high performer isn't just about money, perhaps. High performer is you're going to find satisfaction in that, you're going to be good at it. And those are the kind of matches that people will ride out the storms in life in the future. So we do have a way of the conventional external recruitment, perhaps recruiting teachers who are new into the state from other states as an example, yes. But there's a way of that recruitment process starting earlier on in terms of attracting students into the profession.
Yep. Yeah, and I'll add, I'm seeing a lot of comments about creativity in the classroom, and Carl, this is for another day because that's sort of the retention aspect of being in the career, and I think it's incredibly important. Today we're focusing on recruitment, And to put it, to kind of bring it back to that as we're going to head into breakout groups in just a couple of minutes. But in terms of just to kind of reframe that, what we found in the working groups this spring was the criteria we're using, SATs and GPAs, practice exams for licensure, interviews for getting the job tend to be biased. And they also tend to weed out candidates who have a lot of, if you're an expert at hiring, which even those of us who think we are, we're not. But you can see that we're losing high quality candidates who, based on these sort of superficial, artificial kind of criteria. Can you kind of bring us around to, and yet we need something in place that is scalable. We have 100,000 teachers in North Carolina. We can't, it can't be based on, a 3-day classroom experience, which, by the way, I completely agree with Doug, and the conversation about having more try-on experiences. But, thinking about big industries, how are they doing this in scaled ways?
That's a really good point. Let me talk an aspect of the dealing with the bias thing. So, how there's 3 different ways that we help organizations eliminate or reduce bias. The first one is that we create a benchmark for the role, a behavioral benchmark, and there's 2 ways to do that that make it very non-biased. So this is creating a benchmark in the first place that you can screen candidates against. The most powerful way is to take existing high performers in that job. They go through the questionnaire, the same questionnaire that external candidates would undertake. And then we are doing an analysis of what are the common behavior traits that those high performers have. And that's a number of different aspects. What are their natural preferences? What are their strengths? What are their common weaknesses? There's a lot to be learned for high performers. What are the behaviors that they don't have? And learning from those things. So we take on here sort of a consulting role here and do the analysis on behalf of the client and present those benchmarks back. But the benchmark is system generated. We can't influence it. Okay, so that's the first thing. Then screening candidates against that. When we provide back those candidates to a client, the candidates' names are removed and they are codified. So if I give you a very simple scenario, a client gives us 50 email addresses for candidates who are at a certain stage in the recruitment process. Those 50 go through the assessment tool. And remember, research shows that individuals feel it's a more fair recruitment process when there is a form of assessment taking place. What we present back to the client is the ranked order of those 50 without any names. So when an organization is saying, okay, we want to move forward with the top 15 of those 50 as an example, that decision, they don't know gender, they don't know ethnicity, they don't know age, etc., etc. And it's only at that stage, once they've decided on the 15, that we unlock the full information. But then the data that's being created comparing the individual to the benchmark, the third piece of removing bias, is we then provide interview guides to the organization. And those are programmed interview guides specific to the job role that is being hired against, so that we are providing a continuity. Large-scale organizations in North America, one of their concerns and problems is a different experience for candidates at different locations in the same state or across the country. How can we get uniformity that we know and we have a sense that it's the same quality of interview that's been taking place, that we are being fair in how that interview is being taking place? So we program and format and create on behalf of the client interview guides that's providing the right kind of questions to ask to solicit responses from an individual where they match a benchmark and where they don't match a benchmark.
So what you're saying is we can have consistency, but not one size fits all.
Correct, absolutely.
That sounds kind of like a dream. So the idea that you could have a profile for a science teacher in the East and and really customize it regionally and by subject area, it feels a lot more nuanced and appropriate for this complex profession that deserves better than a one-size-fits-all strategy.
Let me just add something to that on the one-size-fits-all thing. People have asked me sometimes, they envisage, and maybe some people on the call are starting to feel, this is creating robots. We're going to have clones of people, and do we really want that? It doesn't create robots because nobody matches a benchmark completely. Everybody brings something else to the role. So diversity, both in terms of the blind, you know, the unbiased piece is helping support the drive towards greater diversity, which is still a big concern and a big focus in the private sector. But you've also got diversity within those behaviors, because not everybody has a match to the role or to themselves. So just to reassure that we're not trying to create clones and robots in terms of what we're trying to do here.
Well, it's a really compelling topic, and really we wanted to bring it to this group to just look at that there are other ways than GPAs and SATs and ACTs and licensure exams, and they're still fair, and fairness is very important. So I'm very grateful to Carl and Mark